A little bit about Pesach, get us in the spirit, get us in the mood. We're less than a week away from the Seder, and but before we do that, let's just sum up what we learned our last series, the Maimer Kimei Tzescha. So let's just close that out, and then we'll move on to something about the Seder and the first night, the Haggadah, the night of Pesach. Okay. So we learned in the Maimer that we're learning about Yetzias Mitzrayim, about leaving Egypt. We learned that there is the leaving of the limitations of the body, of the animal soul, the challenges, the obstacles and the pressures that prevent us from actually performing mitzvahs, from learning Torah. So that's one type of leaving of Mitzrayim. And then we said there's another one, the spiritual Yetzias Mitzrayim, leaving the spiritual limitations. What does that mean? And why is that necessary? So we said since this whole process of leaving Egypt is leading to the redemption, to the time of Mashiach, and we have to prepare for that time. So since when Mashiach comes, we'll have broken free of all barriers. So therefore we as well have to work on that. And that involves also spiritual ones. What is a spiritual constraint, a spiritual barrier? So we said really even the highest levels of godliness that are involved in creation are already can be considered Mitzrayim. Right? We identified in the Maimer specifically, we identified the beginning of the Kav, meaning the first point of creation, of the evolutionary process of creation, is already considered Mitzrayim, is already a limitation. Why? Because there the light is already confined, the divine light is already confined, it's already defined, it already has parameters, it already has a higher and a lower, and since it already has a definition, it's already limited to the borders of its definition, and that's a limitation. And we said we need to rise beyond that as well. When Mashiach comes, what will be revealed in the world is a level of godliness that's beyond that description, beyond that definition, beyond high and low. Really, what will be revealed is God's essence, which defies description, and therefore, that's a limitless sort of a level of God. And in order to prepare for that, we have to leave even the spiritual levels. Then the Rebbe said, interesting, that specifically, while this is all a process, exile is a process of leaving exile and preparing for redemption, but that takes on a whole new urgency and it reaches a whole new level when we're talking about right before Mashiach, when we have to already start to live Mashiach-like. And so since when Mashiach comes, we're going to be living in a new world, a new order, a new reality, based on, as we said, because we're talking about a whole new level of godliness that will be revealed that wasn't even around really even the beginning of creation. So our service, our preparation also has to be similar and also has to involve a new type of service. What's this new service? So just simply reading in the Maimer, it seems Rebbe is saying that it's al yevosh mipnei hamaligim, not to be intimidated by the scoffers, by the social pressures and norms of the outside, not to be intimidated by them. But the truth is that that's not really the case, because that's been around always. We've always been called to not be intimidated. The first chapter, the first opening law in Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, is not to be intimidated and not to be timid in front of the scoffers. So what the Rebbe says over there is that the newness of that method is not that we have to not be intimidated, but the way we're not intimidated. Today, in today's day and age, our challenges that we face today are more challenging, more difficult. The scoffers today pose a different kind of a threat than in past generations. And the way to overcome it is with the essence of our soul, by revealing the essence of our soul. Similar to what is discussed in the Vat Tetzaveh, the famous Maimer we're all familiar with. The idea of something that it comes as a result of your essence. So, since today we lack deep insight and appreciation for godliness, since today we don't seem to be on any kind of high spiritual level, what motivates us? What motivates us to overcome these challenges? What motivates us to overcome the scoffers? Furthermore, the pressures in the outside world today seem to not be very intelligent. It seems to be a challenge that is really beneath us. The world seems to be consumed with petty things, with foolishness, with fake news, with all kinds of fakeness What's the and so to be able to not be able to overcome that, on one hand you'd say if you're intelligent, so it should be simple, but on the other hand, it's not something you can rationalize with. It's not something you can debate with. So the whole experience, the whole untangling of it, is sort of beneath us in a sense, and therefore the only way to really rise above it is to access a level that's beyond reason. That's the new type of service. That's the leaving the Yetzias Mitzrayim that's expected of us now, and that's the type of service that's going to bring Mashiach. Interestingly, after the Rebbe finished saying this mimer, this is a mimer from Achrein Shel Pesach, the last day of Pesach, and Achrein Shel Pesach, in general, just a side note, every day has its own unique energy, has its own unique its own unique koiches, its own unique avoda, its own unique service, and related to that service, what's expected of us today, we're given the energy to be able to deal with it, to rise and to succeed. Similarly, and really especially when we find this by the holidays, that every holiday has a unique energy that's unique to that holiday, and that's why, interestingly, you'll find in Chassidus questions in a mimer that are unique to a Pesach Maimer. You'll find questions in Maimer that's unique to a Rosh Hashanah Maimer. Wherever you learn any of the Mamorim that are related to holidays, you'll find questions that are asked then and are really only meaningful questions in the context of that holiday. And that's because we're tapping into that energy of that specific holiday. Pesach, we know, is we celebrate the Exodus of Egypt. We talk about the liberation from Egypt, the festival of our freedom, and we're commemorating a historical event. Achrein Shel Pesach, the last day of Pesach, the 8th day of Pesach, we actually turn to Mashiach. Is the day that Mashiach's energy, the ultimate redemption, the energy of the ultimate redemption, is manifested and is expressed and is accessible in our reality. And therefore, we find that much of Chassidus that discusses Achrein Shel Pesach really focuses on Mashiach, the future redemption. So this mimer, which the Rebbe said on Achrein Shel Pesach, is all about how we get to that future redemption. How what we do now ushers in that reality. But there's another component here that sort of not fully addressed head on directly in this mimer, which is the historical Yetzias Mitzrayim, the past event, and that we'll focus on in a moment. But before we get to that, so after the Maimer, the Rebbe said a Sicha where the Rebbe spoke about Al Yevish from Pnei Maligim. He continued to talk about this idea, and the Rebbe identified three types of Maligim, three types of scoffers. We think scoffers, you think anti-Semites, you think atheists, you think of all kinds of people that seem to challenge your faith and question your behavior. But it's not so simple. Those in a way, those are the easiest ones to overcome, the challenges from the outside. So the Rebbe says there's one type of malig, there's one type of naysayer who looks at you and says, "Oh, look at you, you're all holier than thou, and why don't you just be like everybody else? Why can't you just fit in with everybody else? Why do you have to be different?" That's one type from the outside. But then there's another scoffer. That's the one that comes from within your own home. One day you decide, I'm inspired. I'm starting to pick it up. I'm going to be a little bit better. And so your spouse, who knows you very well, or your children know you very well, they say, you decided now you're going to be, now you're turning into Moses. What's going on with you? We know who you are. We know what you're up to. We know your behavior. We know your character. We know where you're at. And so suddenly, what does that do? That squashes that inspiration that you had. And yet an even more difficult challenge to overcome is your own inside, that voice inside of you. When you look in the mirror and you say to yourself, who do I think I am? I know very well who I am. And so trying to behave this way, this is not natural to me, this is not who I am, it maybe is hypocritical. Those are the scoffers that we need to overcome. Now, to be able to overcome that it's very difficult. It's very difficult. Primarily that inner exile, that inner Mitzrayim that we deal with, where we're beyond other people around us, that in a sense almost shame us into falling back into bad habits. It's even our own selves where we feel we don't feel the confidence to be able to grow, to be able to be better. We think to ourselves cynically that we are who we are, we're destined to remain who we are, we can change, we can be better. And the challenge is to And what we're called upon to do is to change, to overcome that, not to give any voice to that sentiment, and to rise above it, and to be better, and to leave our exile, our own personal Mitzrayim. It's something that we're all given the tools and the capability, and we have the capacity to do. So because we were not as great yesterday, or really our entire life even maybe up until this point, but doesn't mean that today can't be different. So that's important. You know how you wake up in the morning, you say today's going to be a whole new day, it's going to be different, it's going to be better than yesterday, and by the time you go to bed at night, you realize it's the same as the day before. And then you hit snooze. And it ends up being the same as yesterday. But really, we have that ability, which is a perfect segue into what we wanted to talk about today. We still have some time. So, this idea of leaving Mitzrayim, and whether we could actually change, what it means to change. So we talked about leaving, in the Maimer, we talked about the physical challenges, or the worldly challenges, the outer challenges, then we talk about the spiritual challenges. What does that mean, and how do we overcome it? How do we change? So what we're gonna talk about is based on a Sikha from Likutei Sichos, volume 26, a Sikha from Parshas Va'era, the first Sikha Parshas Va'era from Likutei Sichos, volume 26. It also is the first of the commentaries in the expanded edition of the Rebbe's Haggadah that has the 2-volume set that has Sichas, and it has letters, and it has all kinds of stuff. So it's the first of that expanded edition. So it's when people leading up to Pesach, you decide this year we're going to really prepare, we're going to study the text, you open up the Rebbe's Haggadah, you learn a little bit from the inside, then you go to the back, you want to learn from the appendix, and you start with the first one. So this maybe people are familiar with, but nonetheless I think it's good to revisit it and explore it. Okay, and let's start, since Pesach is a holiday of questions, so let's start with some questions. Why is it that we celebrate Pesach? What's the big deal? We left Egypt a long time ago. It's old news. Why are we still so fascinated with it? Why are we still celebrating it? Why is it so important? Shouldn't we have gotten over it already? Another question, why? Yeah, that's true, but now we're going to focus on Pesach. Yeah, and another holiday we can ask it then. But really, the other holidays don't necessarily commemorate these historical events the same way. Pesach is the primary. Whatever, the other ones all are offshoots of it. So if we can, right? But that's a continuation. It's a continuation of Pesach. But Sukkot Teshuvah is also a continuation of the Exodus. They all, if we can answer it by Pesach, that can hopefully they all get answered the same way. Right, if we don't answer it, then all the holidays fall away, right? But if we could answer it for Pesach, then that would follow for the other ones as well. But again, our focus here is Pesach. Why is it that when the Jewish people left Egypt, they were in such a hurry to leave? Why did they leave in such a hurry? It says, Ki barach yeah, well, yeah, so that's it. We're always edgy and we're always running. We can never stay in one place. But God has brought Egypt to its knees. Pharaoh comes to kick the Jewish people out. And if they would have said, we're going to take our time, we're going to leave how we want, when we want, on our own terms, we're not coming back, that would have been, you wouldn't have let them go. Of course you would let them go. And yet we read, right after we read about the Exodus in Parshas Bo, in Parshas B'Shalach, we read that the Pharaoh was told that the people escaped. Why did we have to escape? Why couldn't we just walk out the door and not in such a hurry? But it says that when we left Mitzrayim, when we left Egypt, we were in a rush, we were in a hurry. We left, when we ate the Passover sacrifice, we ate with our walking sticks in our hand, where our belts were buckled, where our shoes were on, we were ready to hit the road. Why were we in such a rush? Another question, at the night of Pesach, we eat 3 matzahs. Why do we eat 3 matzahs on Pesach, at the night of the Seder? We know of Lechem Mishnah, we have 2 loaves of bread at all our holiday and Shabbos meals. Why do we have 3 matzahs on Pesach? And why do we have 4 cups of wine? Obviously, the obvious answer is so that we can get through the whole Seder. So we need 4, but then we can ask, why do we have more than 4? But why 4 cups of wine? These are some questions. There are some others, but we might run out of time. I want to try and get to an answer before we run out of time. So, this idea to answer these questions, I think is something that we can also apply to other questions that we might have when we're sitting at our Seder, when we're thinking. Hopefully we'll have the point, we can get this idea out now, and then you can then think about it on your own and figure out how it answers all these questions and many other questions as well. The point is like this, that when we left Egypt, God took us out of Egypt. We didn't just leave, He took us out. Vayetzienu Hashem Misham, God takes us out of there. But when He took us out of Egypt, He took us from the land of Egypt, but He didn't take Egypt out of us. At the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim, the time of the Exodus, we were on a very low spiritual level. It says that the Jewish people, the Gemara says that the Lei Paska Zu Amasan, their impurity was still very much intact. They were still idolaters. They're still impure to the extent that even after we gotten out, a week later, we're at the splitting of the sea, and the angels were still upset that God had taken us out of Egypt. So what are you doing, taking an idolatrous nation that's so depraved morally and spiritually and emotionally? Why are you taking them? What did they do to deserve this? And the truth is, at the time, we hadn't done anything to deserve it. And so even though God takes us out, but we still were, in a sense, unworthy of it. Now, another question, why is it that it took 50 days, the whole point of leaving Egypt, where look, God tells Moshe to tell Pharaoh, to let the people go for 3 days so they can serve him. So that's, but the idea of the escape from Egypt was also, what does it mean we escaped? Because all we had been asking for all that time was just for a 3-day hiatus. We just needed a 3-day vacation to go out to serve God. We didn't say we weren't coming back. And that was the idea that Pharaoh says that he find out that we're not coming back. After 3 days, the Jews are not returning. So if the whole point was to leave Egypt and to go serve God in the wilderness after 3 days, so it would seem that if the point of taking us out is to serve God, so within 3 days we should have been serving Him already. Yet it took 7 weeks until we finally arrive at Mount Sinai, until we receive the Torah. Why that time frame? Why so long? So we know right after Pesach, the second night of Passover, we already start counting the Omer, and we know, as we say in the prayer of the counting of the Omer, that the idea is that we're trying to transform ourselves, to refine ourselves, to prepare ourselves for the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. Why do we need this preparation? So, if we take a look at the description where God tells us that He's going to take us out of Egypt, so you look in the book of Exodus, chapter 6, God tells Moshe to tell the Jewish people, chapter 6, verse 6, I am God, I will take you from the servitude of Egypt, I will rescue you from their service, from the slavery, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great wonders, with great miracles. Verse 7, I will take you to me as a nation, and I will be your God. And you will know that I am your God who took you out of servitude in Egypt. So in verse 6, we have three expressions where God says three expressions. I will take you out of V'hitzesi, I will take you out of Egypt. V'hitzalti, the second expression, I will rescue you. V'ga'alti, and I will redeem you. And then in verse 7 he says, V'lakachti eschem li la'am, I will take you to me as a nation, as a people. So, what's interesting is that the Gemara, the Talmud Yerushalmi says that the reason we have 4 cups of wine, the reason the sages instituted to drink 4 cups of wine is because it corresponds to these 4 expressions of redemption. The 4 expressions that we just said: I will take you, I will take you, I will rescue, I will save you, I will rescue you, and I will take you to me as a people. I will take you out, I will rescue you, save you, and take you to me as a people. So the Mordechai, one of the classic commentaries and halachists, say, and as well as other commentaries, ask if it corresponds to the 4 expressions of redemption. So why do we have 3 matzahs? We should have 4 matzahs. And so they offer different answers to why we have 4 cups of wine. That would not, and those answers would not apply to the matzahs. So that resolves that question. So the Rebbe explains very interestingly. The Rebbe says the truth is that the matzah also corresponds to these expressions of redemption, except that we can divide these expressions of redemption to 2. There's the first 3 in verse 6, chapter 6, verse 6 of Exodus, and then there is the 4th one, which is in verse 7. I will take you to me as a nation. What's the difference? The first 3 expressions are all God. God is going to take us out. He's going to redeem us. He's going to rescue us. As we said, at the time we were totally unworthy of being redeemed. It was God and His initiative and His own. He Himself was the only one involved in taking us out of Egypt. We did nothing to deserve it, to the point that even after we're out, we still weren't even deserving of being redeemed. But v'lakachti eschem li la'am, where God says, I'm taking you out of Egypt, so God could take an enslaved nation, and he could free them, emancipate them. But God wasn't stopping there. He wasn't just freeing an oppressed people. God says, I have a purpose, which is to take you to be my people, to be my nation. What does it mean to be God's nation? So if we fast forward, we talked about before the counting of the Omer, the preparation for the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. If we fast forward, in Parshas Beshalach, God says that, what does it mean to be my people? So he says, "Va'atam tiyu li mamlachas kohanim v'goy kadosh." You're going to be for me a nation of priests and a holy nation. Sorry, it's not. It's in Parshas Yisro. Excuse me. He says. Let's find it here. Chapter 19 in Exodus, verse 6, where he says we're going to be a goy kadosh, a holy nation. Well, how do you become a holy nation? How do you become a holy person? So do you impose holiness on you? And when we talk about change, to add to the list of questions that we ask, what does it mean that we can change? Can we really change? And why is it that when we're inspired in the morning to change, at the end of the day we don't end up changing? Why is it that you can be inspired and really motivated and very sincere and very determined, and yet you don't follow through? Why does that happen? So the thing is like this. In order to change, we first need the inspiration for it. If you don't think that there's anything that if you don't realize that you need to change, so you're not going to change. So the first thing is you need to know that you need to change. That awareness usually comes from outside of yourself, because you're biased and partisan when you think about yourself. Your love for yourself overwhelms everything and skews your perception of reality. And so you might think everything's great. You need to take cues from the outside that tell you that something is not right. So your first awareness has to come from outside, or to put it in the words of the sages, the Talmud, "Ein chavish matir satzmei." The Gemara in Brachos, I think, says that it's where? Yeah, that an inmate can't free himself from prison. You need to be freed from the outside. So when you are imprisoned, and when you're enslaved to your own nature and your own personality, the only way to get out of it, first of all, is it needs to come from outside. Somebody needs to shake you and wake you up and open your eyes to that reality. The thing is, once you're aware of this, that's not enough. Once you're inspired and you're ready to change, if you're going to just live off that inspiration that comes from the outside, it's not going to lead to change. Number one, because it just overwhelms your senses. So think you show up to Shul on Yom Kippur, and you're just sitting in the synagogue, you're fasting, you're doing anything you didn't really think about the day before, you're just stressed over it. And when you're sitting in shul, you're just looking at the time, waiting for the breakfast. Then what happens the moment you leave shul afterwards, after 24 hours of sitting and praying and feeling so connected? You go back to your old ways, because the day overwhelmed you from the outside. But unless you take a hard look at yourself and identify your faults, identify the personality limitations and faults that you need to work on, so you're not going to be able to change them. So the first thing is you need to start identifying. You need to get to know yourself. You need to know where you need to identify those areas that you need to improve. And then you need to focus on why those things are negatives. Why is this thing a bad quality trait? Why is ego so bad? So if you recognize you have an ego and you realize that ego is bad, then you can already start dealing with your ego. But if you're just in the presence of somebody bigger than you, and your ego is subdued at that moment, that's not going to lessen your ego. It's not going to change that reality. For that, you need to acknowledge, you need to identify, you need to understand it, and then you need to be able to work on it. When you confront that ugliness honestly, then you can start to work on it. So when the inspiration is coming from outside, it could be very overwhelming. It could overwhelm all your senses, your personality. Yom Kippur could come and you can behave the way you need to behave just because of the awesomeness of the day. But has that transformed you? Unless you've worked on yourself, it hasn't. It doesn't. So on the one hand, the external inspiration is A, impersonal, and therefore B, won't last. Because since it's not something that you've applied to yourself, you're not going to transform. It's not going to transform you, and it's not going to last. It's going to dissipate. It's going to wear off very quickly. So that's why our inspiration doesn't last. You wake up in the morning, you're inspired suddenly to be better today. What led to that inspiration? You were just sleeping. Why suddenly now you're inspired to be better? That inspiration came from outside of you. So we want to talk mystically, we can say it's your soul hears the baskal, the heavenly voice that's calling out to you to return and to repent, whatever. Point is that it's not a conclusion that you've arrived to from any kind of self-awareness or reflection and self-examination. It's something that just fell on you, and you really are inspired. And it might even get you out of bed into a class in the morning. It might even get you to last even through your morning service, through davening. But then the moment it's over, you're back to where you were. Because unless we take that inspiration and make it our own and start to internalize it and start to reflect on where it is that we do need to improve, how we can apply that inspiration to our life in a meaningful, tangible way, it's not going to last. Similarly, when we leave Egypt, so God takes us out of Egypt, but can you call yourself a Goy Kadosh, a holy nation at that time? We still had we had arrogance and idolatry and we had all kinds of petty personality traits and faults. There's a vart that Friedrich Rebbe says about it says Vayareu Esanu HaMitzrim. So we read it in the Haggadah from the Chumash, one of the psukim that we talk about. It says that the Egyptians made it bad for us. So the Friedrich Rebbe says that you can translate that even more literally, more profoundly, which is that the Egyptians, the slavery in Egypt was so bad that they made us bad. They turned us into bad people. Not just that they made it bad for us, that life was bad, life was difficult, we had a bad life, but that we became bad. So we became bad people. So just taking bad people out of their situation is not going to make them better people. You take, an addict out of his drug den, but it's not going to change him. That's a process that a person has to work on, a personal process, a personal journey that one has to work on. So when we talk about leaving Egypt, there are two stages to leaving Egypt. There's the first stage, which is that inspiration, God taking you out and sending you on a trajectory, on a new journey, saying, here, let me take you out of this situation. But then it's the realization as a result of it is that now it's time to change. And that's the process of self-examination and exploration, getting to know yourself and identifying your personality, failures and faults, and then working on them, perfecting them to start to become a better person. And that's the 7-week period from Pesach till Shavuos. When we talk about 7 weeks later, we receive the Torah. At that point, hopefully, if we had a meaningful experience, a personal experience, we've identified our faults and our flaws, and we worked on becoming better, becoming more sensitive, becoming more godly, becoming more humble. And that process leads us to then, as we stand at the foot of Mount Sinai, where God can call us a Goy Kadosh. So the first 3 expressions of redemption reflect the first part. God says, I'm going to take you out. I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm doing that. It doesn't say anything about us. But then when God says, the fourth one, He says, I'm going to take you to be my people. Just like in this verse says, you're going to be to me, but what are you going to be? You're going to be a Goy Kadosh, a holy nation. God can't impose the holiness on us. You either are a holy people or you aren't. You can't. That's as we just said. If it's forced on you, it's secondary. It's not really you. That's another topic. The point is that holiness we need to be holy. We need to elevate. We need to become better, more sensitive people. Now we can understand why we eat 3 matzahs and we drink 4 cups of wine. Matzah is humble bread, right? Poor man's bread. Matzah represents humility. And matzah, why do we eat matzah on Pesach? Why is it that leaven becomes such an enemy to us on Pesach? The leaven on Passover is more, we look at it more strictly, more severely than we look at pork all year long. It's more unkosher than even unkosher food is. Why is that? Because at the beginning, right as at the birth of our nation, when we start setting out on that service, the idea of ego has to be completely silenced, and we have to overwhelm our own personality, our senses. If you want to be open to set yourself on the path to freedom, you need to be able to first step out of your reality completely, be completely overwhelmed, completely silenced, completely inspired. Allow room for inspiration and for the inspiration to filter in and to impact you. And that's the first step, where God takes us out. And here, we commemorate that with matzah. Matzah represents God taking us out in a hurry. Matzah doesn't rise. Why didn't it rise? Why were we running out in a hurry? Because we were running away from our own ugliness. We weren't dealing with it. There's a story about somebody once came to the Rebbe Marash, the fourth Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Shmuel of Lubavitch, and he had an issue because Chassidim spend a lot of, they emphasize prayer and they pray at length, and he said, I don't understand why you spend so much time in prayer. Imagine, you come to pray, you're sitting before God and talk to God, and the moment you start sitting down to pray, you start you're bombarded, your mind is bombarded by all kinds of foreign ideas and thoughts, inappropriate thoughts, and by inappropriate machshavas, we don't mean inappropriate as in, sinful thoughts. Inappropriate meaning thoughts that aren't related to davening. You're distracted. And so he said, imagine you're traveling, and so you're in your wagon, and somebody starts throwing stones at you. You're going to slow down? You're going to speed up to get away from it. So davening, when we're sort of in harm's way, when stones are being thrown at our minds and our hearts, we should speed it up and get through it quickly. So the Rebbe listened, and he said, yeah, that's true if the one throwing the stones is standing outside of your wagon. But what if he's in the wagon with you? What if the guy throwing stones at you is sitting next to you in the wagon? Now, you're going to go fast. You're not going to be able to shake him by going faster. On the contrary, the only way to deal with him is to slow down and to start dealing with it. To deal with him, to negotiate with him, to reform him, to educate him, to convince him to leave, whatever. You need to, that's a process that takes time. So similarly, when we're leaving Egypt, first thing is we're running out of Egypt. There's an unholiness. We have to run. But then we realize after we get out that the stone throw is still inside. Here we need to already start that process. And that process is what's set in motion now after the exodus of Egypt. It gives us first that opening. Then we have to now slowly and methodically transform ourselves so that when Mashiach comes, we're going out slow. There it says we're not in any hurry. We go out slowly. Why? Because we would have already reformed our insides, our inner selves. All our inner unholiness would have been reformed, and suddenly we're not in a rush. But since matzah, as we say in the Haggadah at the Seder, matzah commemorates the hurry, the rush out of Egypt, so therefore matzah is in 3, corresponding to the first three expressions of redemption. Wine is 4. Why is the wine 4? So here, how much time do we have left? 5? Okay. When we talk about wine represents personality, sophistication, joy. Kabbalistically, it represents the level of bina. So wine represents already an appreciation, understanding, a refinement, a maturity. So here, that comes in 4. Because the 4th expression is V'lakachti eschem li la'am. The 4th expression, so wine represents all 4, the whole picture. Wine represents the whole picture of all 4, the full experience from the Exodus, God taking us out, and then us rising and becoming more sophisticated, more refined, more godly, more holy. That is why the wine commemorates corresponds to the 4 expressions, all 4 of the expressions. But if we wanted to get a little bit more mystical, we can understand that this idea also has significance in the actual number. Not why is it that the first 3 why does God express the first component of the Exodus in 3 terms, and the 4th one only in number 4, only 1 expression and totaling 4. So this too is meaningful. So as we said, the Exodus of Egypt, the first stage, is God taking us out, God's initiative, and only God is involved. That represents the ultimate giver, God, and that is represented in 3, in the number 3. Whereas we, rising to the occasion, the receiver, receiving this great kindness from God, and then transforming ourselves and rising to become a holy nation, that's represented by the number 4. If you ever notice in the Aleph Beis, so the Hebrew alphabet have a numerical value. So the number 3 is the letter corresponds to the letter Gimel. The letter Gimel is 3. The letter Dalet is 4. If you look at the shape of the letters, it always looks like the Gimel is chasing the Dalet, and the Dalet is running away from the Gimel. So you wonder, what did the Dalet do that he's running away from the Gimel? or what's the gimel holding that he's tracing? The gimel looks like it's pursuing. It's got 2 feet. It looks like it's running and facing towards the dalid, and the dalid is facing away from the gimel. So the Gemara in Shabbos says that interesting story about the children that shared these thoughts on the alphabet. These are kids that were learning alphabets, and they said like this: Gimel dalid, Gemol dalim. Gimel, the word Gimel relates to the word Gemol, which means to give, and the word dalid, dalid is that's the needy. So Gimel dalid, give to the dalid, which is why the Gimel is pursuing the dalid, because a real giver is not waiting, doesn't wait for people to come to him. He pursues them. He pursues somebody to give to. So the Gimel is pursuing the dalid, the needy. The dalim is pursuing him, and the dalid has the back leg, the yud in the back is connected, facing backwards towards the Gimel to be able to receive. And as we discussed in the Basi Laganis, we discussed this interaction between the Gimel and the dalid facing back towards the Gimel to the giver to receive. And at the same time, the Gemara says that the dalid though is not, but really the dalid is facing away from the Gimel, even though he has a hand, so to speak, back to receive from the Gimel, but he's facing away, which teaches us that when we give, we should give discreetly. You don't want to embarrass the receiver, so you give discreetly. So the dalid is sort of away. Okay, but we're not going to get into that second part. The point of the Gimel and the dalid, the giver and the receiver. Why is Gimel a giver and dalid a receiver? It sounds cute. Look, you see it in the shape, and you see it in the name of the letter. But how does it relate to the number? When somebody if somebody wants to teach, you want to teach a class, and this is true in everything, even when we talk about giving, you want to give charity or whatever. So the teacher presumably has a lot of information. And the first step for the teacher to start preparing a class is to identify a subject that he wants to teach his students. Once you identify a subject from your vast database of information, your vast reservoir of knowledge that you have, you first identify that information that you want to share, you want to teach about. That's step one. Step two is then to start developing that class and start preparing it in a suitable manner and so that you can present it so the student can understand it. That's step two. And step three is the actual teaching. Go into the classroom and start teaching the class. So you see 3 stages, 3 steps in the giver giving to the receiver. Or if you want to talk about it in the context of charity, you have the giver as he's his own personal self, where suddenly he becomes aware of somebody who needs something. So now that person, the receiver, is now suddenly occupies space within the giver. I've identified somebody who has a need. Then I have to assess that need and see how I can best tailor to that need. What do I have to give to that person? Is it money? Is it food? Is it resources? Is it a job? I have to figure out what it is I need to give them. That's the next part, the next stage. And the third part is the actual giving. What's number 4? Number 4 is the receiver receiving. Number 4 is the way the student processes the information that you give them. Number 4 is already the space of the receiver. So how does this relate to what we talked about? 3 representing the giver. Since 3 represents the giver, God, his involvement in the exodus of Egypt, his involvement in the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim is him taking us out of Egypt, doing it totally on his own, without our involvement at all. So that's represented in the number 3. 3 matzahs. Matzah, the hurry, representing our not being deserving of or worthy of redemption. And God still on his own initiative taking us out. That external inspiration, that's represented in the number 3. And that's why the matzah is a biblical commandment. Matzah that we eat on Pesach is a biblical command imposed by God. God tells us to eat matzah. Wine, the drinking of the 4 cups, is an institution of the rabbis. The Jew is not satisfied with just being obedient and serving God and doing what he tells us to do, having God impose his will on us, but we want to be a holy nation as well. We want to connect with God. We want to rise to God. And so therefore when we study Torah, we have it resonate within us. It makes sense to us, we understand it, and it affects us, it transforms us. And so for that reason, that's also expressed in the institutions of the rabbis, where they themselves also were involved in transmitting Torah and teaching Torah and having Torah understandable and appreciable and something that we can appreciate and understand. And so therefore the rabbinic institution of drinking wine, which represents that wisdom, which represents a maturity and understanding, a refinement, that was instituted in the number 4, because that is the space of the receiver. That's why we have 3 fathers and 4 mothers. The 3 fathers, those represent the mashpia, the giver, that's in the number 3. The mothers the receiver, that's 4. So you have 3 and 4 as well, the same idea. Why Torah is called Shma B'ni Musar Avicha, the written Torah, the Bible is referred to as the ethics of your father. But Al Titesh Torah Simecha, not to forget, not to stray from the teachings of your mother, that refers to the oral tradition that was primarily transmitted and developed by the rabbis, by the sages. So you have the giver, you have the receiver, the father, the mother, 3 and 4. And we don't have time to address, but this also answers a very puzzling question, and I'll leave it for you to think of on your own. But it's interesting, halacha says that if you swallow the matzah, so you fulfill the obligation of eating matzah. We have a biblical obligation to eat matzah on Pesach. If you just swallowed it, and God bless you if you're able to do that, then you fulfill the obligation. But if you ate matzah that has a taste, flavored matzah, then you haven't fulfilled the obligation. So chocolate-covered matzah doesn't work, or matzah ashira, a matzah that was, you made a cake out of your matzah. It's matzah, but it's not matzah you can fulfill your obligation with. So 1 second. Do you have to taste it or not? If you don't have to taste it, if you can swallow it and not taste it, you fulfill the obligation, so why does matzah have to taste like matzah? And if matzah has a taste, a fancy, sophisticated taste, and you can't fulfill the obligation with that because it has to taste like matzah, then how are you allowed to swallow it? That's something, ten l'chacham yech kamoid, to reflect on your own. Sorry?